want to talk a little bit about healthcare, right, and where we're at. But first, as much as it pains me, I have to disagree with Kyle, because I very rarely disagree with him about anything, because he's much smarter than I am. But the one disagreement I would have is, you are not our customers. We only have one customer. That's our patient. And we need to be laser focused on who our customer is and how we create value for them. You obviously are key stakeholders and partners in our ability to deliver value to our patients. But that laser-like focus, how do we make sure that we're creating value for our patients, for our true customers, is critical for, I think, healthcare and specifically for Fairview's success. So, no surprise, right, that we're going through a rather turbulent time. Having done this for a number of years, we like to tell ourselves this pretty regularly. Oh, boy, it's really, a lot of turmoil, a lot of change. It's something different at this point. I'm going to try to make a case for why. Now, it's certainly different that trying to understand healthcare policy is a little interesting right now. I never thought I'd have to get up in the morning and look at my Twitter feed to figure out where we're going at a national level, but it is kind of where we're at. From a federal policy level, it is hard to see whether we're pro value-based programs or anti. Right? We had one secretary who came in and said, well, we don't believe in the kind of bundled payment programs. We're ceasing those. Now we have a new secretary who says, no, that's exactly the direction we need to go. So I think at the end of the day, for us, what we have to anticipate is we have to create value for our customer, right? But there are just a number of things going on. I'm going to make the macroeconomic argument first. I remember the Wall Street Journal article. We found a copy of it here, but there was a picture on the front page, and it showed a domestic General Motors assembly plant. But the gist of the article was the single most expensive part in this car is the health benefits of the people who put it together. And at that point, there was a sea change, right? That suddenly employers said, no more. We're not going to continue to absorb medical inflation at the rate that we have been, right? We can't afford to do it. So that source of absorption of our medical inflation that had been occurring for 30 plus years was gone. Now, how did they balance it? They started pushing it to consumers. Now, again, I'm old enough to remember the self-talk that we had. We'd say, look, it's good, consumerism is positive, but for people to be consumers, they need to have skin in the game. Well, we're well past the dermal layer at this point, right? We're at the musculoskeletal layer. If you look at this graph, if a median household income, over 30% of their median household income is going to healthcare expenses. The average deductible in the US in a consumer-defined plan, a high-deductible plan, is $4,700 for an individual, $7,400 for a family. People simply can't afford to continue to absorb medical inflation. So, of the sources who can absorb medical inflation, let me see, we've got the government. Well, last I checked, the debt has gone up quite a lot. It's going to continue to go up given the tax increase. And it's unlikely that they're going to absorb medical inflation, that they're suddenly going to shift policy. Employers are saying, no, we can't do it anymore. We can't afford it. It's too big of a line in our operating expense report. Consumers can't. They simply can't. They can't afford it. So who do you think is going to end up holding the bag of medical inflation as we go forward? My belief is it's organizations like Fairview. It is going to be the larger, multi-specialty, integrated care delivery organizations who will have to absorb medical inflation, will have to be able to take on total cost of care. Now, I have my moments when I get up in the morning and I think about, God, this job would have been a lot easier 35 years ago. The good old cost plus days, you get to the end of the year, you add up how much it costs, you add 10, 15%, you hand the check over to somebody else and you go on with your day. But those days are gone, and I actually think it's a good thing because of all of the people in this kind of parade, healthcare organizations, healthcare delivery organizations are probably best positioned to actually do something about medical inflation, to affect it in a different way. but it's going to require a significant amount of change on our part. The status quo simply isn't going to work. And so if you talk to any of our folks, I don't know that we pretend to have any of the answers, but we're pretty crystal clear about a couple of things. One is the patient is our customer, and we got to get focused around our customer. And two is the status quo is not going to work. We have to change. We have to be able to learn and adapt as we're going along. So, interesting environment. I stole this from the advisory board. I kind of like it, right? Here's the world I live in, we live in. We've got a lot of downward revenue pressures, to say the least, right? A lot of things that are going to be pushing down on how much more revenue we're going to get in any given year. Simultaneously, we got a number of upward cost pressures. And I'm a simple mathematician, but when I look at that equation, what that means is we're going to be under terrific pressure on our margins. And so we're going to have to attack both of these. But the thing that we're really going to have to attack is not the revenue side, because there's just not going to be that much more revenue flowing into healthcare. But we're going to have to take on the cost side. And again, we're going to have to innovate. So what does that mean? Well, one of the ways that we have to innovate, this is a scary graph to me. One of the fundamental things that has changed, if you were a medical student who happened to master the entire body of clinical knowledge in 1950, at that moment in time, you would have expected that body of knowledge to double in 50 years. About the year 2000, you would have seen that body of knowledge get twice as big. Fast forward to 2020. If you're a medical student, how fast do you expect that body of knowledge to double? 73 days. That's how fast our knowledge of clinical medicine is expanding. So what are the implications of that? Well, look, the idea of the all-knowing, all-seeing, compassionate, Marcus Welby-like physician is gone. We simply can't produce human beings who can be trained and then adapt fast enough to be able to live in that kind of world. So we're going to have to think very differently about what we surround our clinical professionals with to be able to support them through what are going to be vast changes, many of which your industry is driving, right? Some of the startling breakthroughs that we're starting to see, cancer treatment. Think about the way we treat cancer today and how we're going to treat cancer in 10 years. We're going to look back to today and say, well, that was pretty archaic. That was almost medieval, as opposed to the targeted therapies that we'll be able to do at the individual basis. Kyle mentioned I left Stanford University. That was my last organization. I mean, even there, right, we were starting to do targeted therapies to individual patients mixed in the lab for that patient. That's going to be more commonplace and normative treatment in 10 years. Now, the other hard part of this is, I love this study. I think it was 2010, right? And it looked at survival rates with small cell lung cancer. And two arms of the experiment. One arm was kind of normative treatment. Let's throw everything at these patients. Most died in the ICU. Other arm of the study was palliative care. Patients received palliative care and looked at then several characteristics of those two cohorts. One was, obviously, we'd spend less money on those folks who didn't die in the ICU, who received the palliative care arm. That was not the most interesting thing. You'd expect that. What was interesting was that the arm of palliative care actually outlived the arm who got normative treatment. This is the other inherent complexity of what we do, is that it's not simply a mechanical, science-driven endeavor. It is bound up in this interaction with people and the psychology and of what we bring as individuals to any treatment regimen, to any point of care, to any point in life. That's fundamentally going to transform, and we need to continue to think about how we bring our patients into this process and meld the two, right? To be able to bring together the best in science, but to recognize this isn't simply a science experiment. The psychology of the patient has to be taken into account. Now, technology. another driving force. I believe we're at the crest of a fundamental transformation, maybe the second wave of information technology. You recognize this, right? The QWERTY keyboard? The QWERTY keyboard was invented for a very specific purpose, right? Typewriters were being developed in the mid-1800s, and they had a problem, because when they originally put the keyboards together, they arranged them in alphabetical order. The problem they found was if you have keys that are adjacent to each other, which are used often, the two mechanical arms jam, like S and T. If you arrange them in alphabetical order, S and T jam, slowing down the typist. So some smart person, probably a statistician, thought, okay, I'm going to arrange the keys in a distribution that minimizes the probability of two adjacent keys being typed and therefore minimize the probability of these arms jamming. A perfectly reasonable solution to a real problem. The irony is, we are still using that frickin' keyboard. So now we take MD PhDs with their Mavis Beacon typing skills, and we put them in front of a computer mediated by a QWERTY keyboard to get information in and out of this marvelous technology. Little wonder that they're not very happy about this. Now, I had my 2 weeks of fame recently when I made a comment about Epic being one of the biggest dampening effects to innovation in healthcare. Are there any reporters in the room? I still believe that, by the way. And it's not that I'm anti-EMR. I'm not. I'm old enough to remember paper records. That damn paper record was never where the patient was. The fat chart, you never knew everything that was in that fat chart that you needed to at the time that you were working with a patient. So it's not that I want to go back to 1970s paper charts. I believe in EMRs. But I think the challenge is we aren't using that information technology to its full extent. But what's going to happen is, if you have Alexa at home, I have a very intimate's probably too strong, but a very close relationship with my Alexa. You know, I get home at night and I say hi to my lovely wife and pat my dog on the head, and it's not too long after that I'm headed to bed. And every night I go through the same routine. Alexa, please set the alarm for 4:45 a.m. And she does it. Alexa, please play Minnesota Public Radio, and she does it. I set the sleep timer for 12 and a half minutes. Why 12 and a half minutes? Well, one, I'm not going to be awake very long, but two, because I could name any time and she's going to do it. It's remarkable technology, that voice recognition. Now imagine, as we fast forward that to Alexa in our exam rooms, Alexa in our OR theaters, Alexa in our pharmacies, that ability to be able to have that interaction, not mediated by a stupid QWERTY keyboard, to be able to access and deliver information in a seamless and non-intrusive way. That is one aspect of literally thousands of innovations that we're on the precipice of seeing. And there are a number of, I knew 5, now there's probably 50 companies who are working on exactly that in healthcare specifically. We're also going to be then this idea of the Internet of Things. We are going to be connected to everything, including us are going to be connected. I mean, I have my favorite Apple gadget, right, my iWatch. I'm sure that Apple can track me everywhere, but it's also looking at my potential for heart arrhythmias, right? I'm participating in the Stanford study. Think of the size and scale of that study, but also think about the ability to have absolute knowledge of where stuff are at and what the state of things are. The challenge we're going to have as healthcare organizations is great. That's a huge flow of data. Well, we don't use the current data very well, right? And I'll talk a little bit about that in terms of where we're going as an organization. But now I'm going to compound that by having a complete flow of information of every person, staff member, physician, patient, every piece of equipment, every geographic location. I'm going to have complete information. But how do I use that effectively in our operations? But that's the future we're moving into. And if you think about any other industry, I was in Memphis not too long ago at the FedEx Operations Center. This is fascinating. You know, worldwide, they know where every package is at every moment. Worldwide. We run a relatively large healthcare system, but even at an individual hospital level, I don't have that level of information. I can't have that level of situational analysis. And we're taking care of patients. I mean, our mistakes can be fatal. But yet, people moving packages are much better at being able to use that information effectively to be able to manage their operations. I was fascinated. They have like 7 airplanes flying deadhead all the time on various routes because they know, because of their data, that they're going to have a certain number of mechanicals on their planes, and so they need those planes available at, within a geographic location, area, to be able to land, transfer packages there, and keep things flowing. What if we ran our hospitals or our healthcare organizations with that level of capability and discipline? What would that be like as a patient? So we're going to have to be equipped to be able to manage a whole different level of flow of information. Now, it's also difficult because, yes, I believe care delivery systems are going to have to take the responsibility for managing total cost of care in partnership with many, many kinds of organizations. The challenge is we don't impact that much of total cost of care, right? There's been a number of these kinds of studies. This is from Brookings and Kaiser Family Foundation. The estimate is that healthcare, the clinical things that we do, only impact about 10 to 15% of total cost of care. That's a lot of cost that we're not having any direct impact. What are the other things? Well, one, did you do a good job of selecting your parents, right? What's your genomic makeup? That predisposes you to certain things. Where do you live? What's your zip code? We have data where literally within a mile, I can show you in the Twin Cities, within a mile, the life expectancy of the population of those two geographies varies by 5 years. Within a mile. But the difference is the socioeconomic, the availability, the educational level of those two communities that are in very close proximity to each other. All right? The things that are going to impact whether we do a good job of total cost of care, in large part, will be our responsibility to be a convener and a partner for a whole bunch of other resources to be able to impact the health of our communities. So there are a number of different organizations. We're one of them that are very involved with anchor institutions. I was in Pittsburgh a number of years ago. The first time I'd ever been in Pittsburgh, and I was driving across the bridge, and it hit me. What used to be the U.S. Steel tower right there, the big skyscrapers you come across the bridge, is now UPMC. If there was ever a bigger signal of what's happening in our economy and in our lives, and the role that healthcare plays as 20% of the GDP, it's that, right? UPMC is a major driver of the economy in Pittsburgh, as are we a major driver of the economy in the Twin Cities, and as healthcare generally is a major driver. Well, part of what we're going to have to figure out is how do we use that? And the idea of anchor institutions is, well, how do we think about that in terms of how we supply our organization? Do we use local suppliers? Do we buy local food? How do we invest? How do we invest in the economic health of our communities? That has not traditionally been the role of healthcare organizations. But if we're going to acquit ourselves of a responsibility that is inevitable that we have to take on, which is to manage the total cost of care, we're going to have to think about our communities and our relationship to those communities in a very different way. And, given we're $2 trillion of the economy, a lot of people want to get into healthcare. Now, that's not necessarily a new thing, but wow. And it's not the traditional players. One, I would have never thought CVS and Aetna in a million years. Now, it makes some sense at the end of the day, now that it's together, but I wouldn't have guessed that. And then, just when I was flabbergasted by that, I've got Amazon, JP Morgan, and Berkshire Hathaway coming together and saying, we're going to take on this healthcare thing. And I was just in Boston 2 days ago and saw Atul right at they were announcing it. Now, I wish him the best of luck. He is an incredibly smart guy. But man, what a wrestling match that's going to be. But the idea of that level of organization coming directly into healthcare. There was a couple of announcements. Anybody from Amazon here? I'm kind of surprised. There's a couple of announcements that seem to indicate that Amazon wasn't going to be coming into healthcare. Those are wrong. I mean, we will see more and more of Amazon in healthcare. We'll see more and more of non-traditional entrants and competitors and partners in healthcare. Our world is going to get turned upside down in many ways by these organizations. I'm waiting for, Google and Apple to start buying healthcare providers. We can't be too far away, right? Optum is already the largest. They are the biggest employer of providers in the country. So again, very dynamic time. So hopefully we can keep our little surfboards on top of the big waves. That's the idea. And let me tell you a little bit about how we are approaching this. I know the intent of this is to give you some sense of the context of what's important to us so that you can help us and be better partners to us. So again, I'll come back to where I started. Look, at the end of the day, we have to do a better job of serving our patients, truly being patient-centric. They want transparency, knowledge, and control, right? This is one of the quotes that I picked off the paper when Jamie Dimon was talking about what the Berkshire Hathaway partnership with Amazon and JP Morgan was about. That's right. And they transfer those expectations from everything else that they do in their lives, right? Every other organization that they interact with. And if we think that we can continue on doing things the way we've done and have a level of forgiveness that we've historically had with our patients, our consumers, our customers, not going to happen. So, my belief, I think we're on the precipice of a different model of healthcare, and I want Fairview to be a leader in that. So the first model of healthcare was really the patient as pinball, the fee-for-service system. Now we know what that's produced, right? Poor safety, poor quality, poor patient experience, and high costs. Besides that, it's a perfect system. And in many ways, it's a system that has served us well in terms of its innovative power. It is the unique feature of the US healthcare system. We are by far the most innovative healthcare system in the world. And we have to be careful not to lose that. The second model, like the second generation, in large part a response to the laissez-faire, fee-for-service, good luck, hope it works out for you, for the patient, was managed care. Now, managed care is a very paternalistic, maternalistic, we know best patient, you're doing silly stuff, we're going to direct you. And we have a number of mechanisms through which we do that direction. Narrow networks, ACOs, prior authorization rules, referral rules, et cetera, to be able to try to move patients to what we believe is the best site of care, type of care, person who's delivering the care, et cetera. The problem is that runs, as far as I know, we still live in America, a place where patients value choice a great deal. I was in California before this. I think the best managed care organization in the world, quite frankly, is Kaiser California. They do a tremendous job. But even as the best managed care organization in the world, they've had 42% commercial market share forever. Because 58% of the population actively goes, I like you, but what if I really get sick? I want to have the freedom to go where I need to go. If I'm really sick and the person I need to be seen at is at Stanford, I want to go to Stanford or UCSF or MD Anderson. They value choice. So I think this model is inherently limited. And especially it's going to become more limited in a world where people have more and more of their own economic self-interest involved. So what does that mean? Well, go backwards. I'll come back to it. We're going to try to create a different model. A model that is much more consumer-oriented, that tries to balance in the belief that if you give people information and good help, good support at the front end, right? That one point of contact, there's somebody out there to help solve your healthcare problems, they're more likely to come back to you and use resources efficiently than not. That would truly be a consumer-oriented model. You go to Amazon, you search for something, Bezos shows you the competitors. Now, in what business model does that make sense? Yet, I shop a lot at Amazon because I hate shopping. I hate going out stores. I always buy from Amazon. Why? Because they've created such a friction-free environment. I hit click and suddenly magic happens, right? Suddenly the package is at the door. Now, like within a couple of hours sometimes, it's kind of magical. But the reason you don't go look at all of this, competitors' websites is it's so easy, it's so seamless, so supportive within Amazon. We will see those kinds of organizations, I believe, coming much more to the fore and being successful in healthcare. And our idea at Fairview is we want to be very early on and very much a leader in that kind of organization, truly being consumer-oriented, truly being customer-oriented. So how are we going to do that? Well, we think about this in several different ways. First of all is data analytics. I'll talk about that. I'll talk a little bit about consumer technology. I'll talk a little bit about primary care and care coordination, but the true experts follow me. Eric can talk quite a bit more about that. And then I'll talk a little bit about our operating system and the rationale for that. So this set of what we think of as platform capabilities are, I believe, critical for us to be able to fulfill this vision. I drive about a $6 billion organization in the rearview mirror. Now, if you were going to get on 494 out here and take off and try to drive your car looking through the rearview mirror, how would it work out for you? Probably not that well. You'd have a good view of what you just hit. Well, that's exactly what happens every day. I get reports of 30, 60, 90 days ago, right? The data is that lagged, of what we hit. Not all that helpful. Yes, maybe we can go back and we can sleuth out, okay, well, what was the root cause and how did this happen? And maybe we can pull that information, if we can determine it, forward into the current time frame to say, well, what are we going to do differently? But it is incredibly slow and inherently responsive, not anticipatory. Right? We are fighting fires, not avoiding fires. So what we're after is how do we create a much better analytic environment so we can be much more predictive, much more anticipatory. Can I drive the car looking out the front windshield now, where I can see things happening? So part of what we have to be able to develop is that capability to really be able to do what FedEx is doing with packages across the world, is to be able to see events as they unfold, to be able to understand what those conditions mean, and to anticipate how that's going to play out so that we can avoid that. Now, if you think that doesn't have applicability in a hospital or a healthcare organization, I invite you to go to your ED. Because it plays out every day in a hospital. And it usually symptomatically manifests itself in the ED. All right? Got a bunch of patients coming in. It's predictive. I can tell you pretty clearly how many patients are going to show up in an ED at any point, time of day, day of week. But we treat it like it's a new event every day. And we get long hold times and wait times because on the other end of that, we have patients on floors. And if you look at a hospital, one of the first things you need to look at typically is, well, what's my average time of discharge? And how many discharges are occurring in the morning? And in most hospitals, because we tend not to think about this, it happens later in the day. And especially in a teaching hospital because, residents have to come through and they've got other things and they've got, classes they've got to go to or sessions that they've got to go to and the attending gets there and orders finally get made and then all the transportation issues, it's 3, 4, 5 o'clock by the time patients discharge. But by that time, the ED's backed up because you see the bolus of that first wave. Cases are coming out of the ORs needing beds, but you haven't made any beds available. Those are completely predictive events. You know they're going to happen. We just don't manage them proactively. So as we start to get event-level data and can start to model and anticipate that, we can manage that much more effectively. Right? That is one tiny example. Now, in a larger system like ours, I was at an ICU in one of our hospitals, and it was a relatively slow day. I walked in, and I'm a mathematician, but I can figure out clinically when it's a slow day, no patients in beds, right? So, and I talked to the charge, and she goes, "Oh yeah, slow day. Elective cases were down. ED had a slow day, so we let some of our staff go earlier." Perfectly reasonable move. Of course, that's what you do to manage your labor costs. Same day, I'm in our academic center, in the ICU, and it is off the hizzle. I mean, people are scrambling. There are no beds. It is chaos. And I asked the perfectly reasonable question, well, did you call this other hospital I was just at? And they said, oh, yeah, we did, but they didn't have any capacity. Well, of course, they didn't have any capacity because they let nurses go because they were managing their own local context. We weren't thinking as a system. So as FedEx thinks about, they don't think about one plane or one geography. They think about one geography, one plane in the context of a broader system. So better analytic capability allows us to really think about that in a different way. Consumer technology. God loves my Apple Watch. I didn't know I needed it until I started wearing it. Now I can't do without it. But I'm probably a little bit of an early adopter. My kids are 25 and 27. Everything they do, where they're going to eat, where they're going to go, who they're going to date, seems to be mediated by this device. Now, the convenience for people in my generation is nice, and we tend to be users of this technology. But we see it as somewhat of not an expectation of our healthcare organizations to have a well-integrated experience digitally. Otherwise, people would probably be looking more at other healthcare organizations because most healthcare organizations don't do a terribly good job of this. All right? But my kids' generation, this will be fundamental. If you can't deliver transparency, access, immediacy, feedback, they won't look at you. So we're trying to drive a very aggressive agenda about this user interface, this front end. How do we make our system transparent? How do we provide access in as many possible ways? How do we create a level of knowledge transfer and two-way communication so that we can really integrate our care processes with our patients' lives? Because one of the other things that this allows us to do is take advantage of what we feel incredibly powerfully right now is the move away from the inpatient environment towards cheaper, lower capital intensive environments. Ambulatory surgery centers, other ambulatory environments are the first stop in that, but it's not the last stop. Home's the last stop. More and more of our care is going to be delivered in the home. Well, how do we integrate that? Because our whole premise with hospitals is how do we bring everybody to us for the convenience of us? And that paradigm is going to fundamentally change in large part, fueled by this idea of consumer technology. The third piece is around primary care and care coordination, right? I still believe, and as Kyle mentioned, I was a group health cooperative in Seattle. What I would say is one of the truly great managed care organizations, Ed Wagner, the father of the chronic disease model, his office was 2 doors down from mine. We had registries, in the early 1990s. We were doing evidence-based medicine in the early 1990s. A lot of very innovative things came out of there. Probably fueled in part by my experience there, but certainly reinforced in California and even at Stanford in academic is the importance of good primary care. Now, not primary care as gatekeeper, but primary care as key point of interface and as a support mechanism for patients as they're going through the incredibly complex process of trying to manage their health, especially at points whether they have chronic disease or acute onset of health issues, to be able to manage that effectively. And so part of what Eric will talk about is how we're reimagining healthcare and primary care and take advantage of some of the things I've already talked about. How do we use better information and create that situational awareness for our primary care teams? How do we use digital technology in a fundamentally different way? And then finally, If you Google me, which I wouldn't recommend, but if you do, one of the things you'll see is I'm usually associated with lean. Because I have used the precepts of Toyota Production System now as a basis for transformation of 4 different organizations, starting back in Seattle in 2003. Virginia Mason, Gary Kaplan was just starting his efforts about 2 years before that. So know Gary well and agree with many of the things. But the thing that I saw that I thought was fundamentally different about lean is I've been involved with, I was on the faculty of the IHI with Don Berwick in the early 90s. I've been involved with quality for a long time. And before that, I was involved in quality in industry. What the difference with lean is it's not the improvement process, right? It's not flow. It's not just in time. I mean, if you've read Henry Ford's book, Today and Tomorrow, Henry Ford had all that dialed in the early 1900s. You know, raw iron ore coming into the River Rouge plant, the 6th floor, Model Ts rolling out the bottom floor. He understood flow in a very sophisticated way. That's not new, right? What is different about what Toyota did was they created a management system that supported continuous improvement in a very different way. Our goal at Fairview, we have about 34,000 employees. I want 34,000 people walking in every day, feeling equipped and invited to make us a little bit better. To continually challenge, well, yes, I know this is our standard work, this is our best way, that we know how to do it, let's find a better way. What's the experiment we're running? But in that kind of very dynamic environment, you cannot manage in the same old way that you always have. It doesn't work. And that's why so many quality improvement transformations, TQM, Lean, Six Sigma fail. Is we think it's an improvement methodology and we train the heck out of people and we hire a bunch of people to help support the other people to do quality improvement, and then inevitably we don't manage any differently and we move on to the next fad. But one of the things that we're working on is really using this as a cultural change mechanism. I want 34,000 people who feel like Fairview is their organization, that they are owners. They're not just people I rent through the mechanism of a paycheck. Because most of you, I'm sure, have rented a car. How many of you washed the car before you brought it back? I did this in a group about this size. I had 2 people raise their hands and say, well, we did. And of course, you got to go there, right? They both had the same story, independent. They're on the big island of Hawaii, and you know you sign that agreement when you get a rental car on the big island, you're not going to take it over Mauna Kea. Both of them had, and they had to wash the red mud off the rental. That is the only reason I could ever think of why you would wash a rental, because you don't own the damn thing. That's why we want to create a culture of owners. And I think as you interact with our people, you'll see the sparks of that. But we have to make that a generalized process, a generalized capability at every level. It doesn't matter if you're the environmental services worker interacting with a patient, or you're an MD, PhD, or a pharmacist, or any other individual that makes a large healthcare organization go. If you don't feel like it's yours, if you don't feel ownership, we don't get the benefit of your intellect and your energy and your passion and your grit. So our mechanism, the reason why we're doing this and our focus on the management system is in large part to be able to achieve that. So when you come in and interact with us and we have kind of some specific ways that we talk and think, it's not that we're a cult. What we're really trying to do is create an environment where everybody can be an owner and we can learn aggressively from each other. And if we all have a different idiosyncratic way, it is really difficult to learn from each other at scale. Now, I'll end with this thought too. You know, one of the things we're doing, and you probably will experience this as you interact with us, is we're really trying to organize ourselves around our customers. So we have a long history of being a holding company, right? A separate, you run your geography, your hospital, your entity, separate from all the rest. And I'll hold you accountable for your P&L, and you sink or swim, and that's kind of the end of the story. Well, that's great, except you're not a system. You're not leveraging the capabilities. And so part of what we did as I came here was break down those boundaries by starting to think of ourselves much more around our service lines and the care continuum within those service lines. So how do we think about a cardiovascular patient starting in primary care all the way through onset of disease, treatment of disease, back home, and management of a chronic disease? Same with cancer, same with musculoskeletal. So really transforming the organization, turning it sideways, and starting to organize around our patients. Now, it is very early days with this, but it's changed our thinking in terms of what's my relationship and to whom. Is my relationship to the building, or is my relationship to the patient and the people who are upstream and downstream from me? And that's part of the transformational effort. So I am sure that you will feel this. It has significant implications for Bob and Kyle and Tim and the folks in pharmacy. Certainly has big implications for how do we think about relationships and how we manage this large organization and all of the supporting infrastructure that it requires. But the main intent here is to get us to focus around our patients. Again, ending where I started in my subtle disagreement, my small disagreement with Kyle around we only have one customer. That is our patient. We have a lot of partners and a lot of stakeholders, and we need them all. But the end is to be able to focus on our patients and create unique and durable value for them so they keep coming back to us and trust us and see us as a valuable partner in their lives. So, the one thing we got to worry about is being myopic. We think what we have always seen and what we see today is what the future will be. Not true. My message to my organization is, the thing that we have to do is we have to change. And we won't get it all right. We will do things and we'll say, oh, sounded like a good idea at the time, didn't plan out the way we thought, we're going to have to pivot. We're going to have to adjust. We have to learn. And if we can create that kind of attitude across our organization, my belief, given the capabilities, given the people that we have, we're going to do okay. So there's my story. I'm sticking to it, and love to answer any questions you might have if we have any time.
With Apple and all those things, it's clear what the package should be. In healthcare, It's not so clear. Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes it's not clear what the problem is, and that's part of the reason why you don't have the quote package unquote at the door in 2 hours. And so how does Fairview address that kind of disconnect between the world of Apple and those companies and reality of healthcare on the other?
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're right. We're not a linear organization or a linear endeavor. Healthcare doesn't work that way. We're inherently Bayesian. Is this the right diagnosis? Well, I don't know. I'm going to treat and see if it improves. If not, maybe I don't have the right diagnosis. Is this the right treatment? I don't know. I know you have hypertension. I saw that. Is this the right treatment for your hypertension? Well, we're going to have to try it. It's not a linear process. My argument, though, is that even makes it more important for healthcare to be more sophisticated in terms of how it works, not less. What we've done is basically depended on heroes. Heroes as physicians, heroes as pharmacists, to be able to own the accountability and the complexity and make it up as they go along because of the inherent complexity you point out. Well, what's the result of that? We've got a burnout crisis. We've got poor quality and poor safety. We're expensive. So my counter argument, which your premise is absolutely right, we are not as simple. I worked at Boeing for a few years, right? Quality. And they lay out all the processes. It's a straight line. You can see the plane coming together. Even there, relatively trivial, right? Healthcare is not that. But my argument would be even more reason to bring more sophisticated approaches than simply kind of throwing people out in a Darwinian environment and saying, good luck, bonne chance, bon voyage, bon voyage. If you survive, great. If you don't, I'll find another one like you.
As the companies here in the room are trying to figure out how to go risk with Fairview, and it can be a lot easier for maybe a device company, implantable cardiac device. And so somebody that comes from industry in the past, and I'm not there currently, it might be a little easier for me to ask this, but do you have any certain lessons learned that you can offer them so they can avoid the proverbial shift at risk where, it's kind of like the unicorn, the risk doesn't really agree or doesn't really exist? Any lessons learned that you've heard where it's been a good risk share agreement or maybe not so much?
Yeah, although I'm not sure it does the good question justice. Look, I think risk partnerships work when it's truly a partnership. If you go back to the 90s and mid-90s and a little bit beyond, where basically we pushed risk onto primary care and said, here, you guys manage it. It wasn't a partnership. It was good for the person who was pushing the risk, but primary care had none of the tools, none of the capabilities, and a lot of primary care groups got hurt in that. That was an asymmetric relationship. Good for one party. The other party was naive, but didn't know what they were doing, and it jumped into it with bad effect. I think those kind of risk partnerships have to go in, one, eyes wide open about, look, we don't know the how of this. We know the what, right? We want to increase the efficacy and the specificity of the treatment, right, to the patient. And we want to decrease costs over time because we don't want to use ineffective treatments on patients who aren't going to benefit. But if there's trust, you can go in and you can experiment around that. That's why I love the piranha exercise, right? Those are hard problems. And the idea is, well, let's create a partnership around these hard problems. I mean, that's the idea of Accelera generally. How do we create a partnership around hard problems? And then think together about them, knowing that there's shared benefit. So that's not a great answer to a very good question, because I don't think there's a one-off, here's the formula. I think you got to create true partnership, where both partners, the rising tide lifts all boats, right? Sometimes that's hard to find. And there's enough trust that you can go in not knowing the what, but not get into the blame game when the first attempt doesn't work out the way that you want it to, isn't optimal, doesn't even succeed, because you're inherently in an environment where there's not a pattern, there's not a recipe. Do it like this. And in those environments, you got to be willing to fail forward, right? To be able to trust, to be able to work together to find those solutions. And that's part of why I think Bob and his team have been so successful, is they've created those kinds of partnerships to be able to continue to drive knowledge and drive partnership that creates learning and shared benefit for the parties involved. Now, what this looks like if we say, look, how do we think about pharma and shared risk? Yeah, I don't know. I'm not that smart. My bet, though, is the answer's in rooms like this if we can create the environment and the partnerships and the trust that are requirements for that kind of relationship and that kind of forward progress. All right, well, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving me the time, and please enjoy the rest of the day.